Authority has a full agenda. I'm going to go over some very, very light housekeeping things just because everybody's working with different online tools and this is a large group that's convening. First of all, if you're not operating in Chrome as your browser, you might want to log out and re-log in. That's the optimal situation for Chrome. And as we hit the hour here too, I'll also say that this meeting is going to be made available to the public. That'll be published to the city's website. It's hosted on YouTube. But in case for some reason you're a member of the public and you lose connection, don't despair. This will be available. And I'm kind of checking here how many individuals that might affect. Otherwise, I see a consensus, I see a number, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I see a Port Authority quorum, although we're not making any actions in this first part of the meeting. And I see 6. Almost all of council. I do not see Brian Woodley yet, although he's probably coming from work. So it is 7 o'clock. And John, I'll allow you to introduce your Port Authority meeting. I think our logistics are you open and then recess and we'll open our special meeting.
Yep, that's correct.
Sounds good.
So let's call the Wabasha Port Authority and Development Agency meeting to order for Tuesday, May 18th. First order of business will be to recess at this time. And it is now 7:01.
Very good. And I will call to order at 7:01 the special city council meeting of the city of Wabasha. And we won't have any formalities, but as I said, if you're not functioning on Chrome, you might find that a better experience in terms of your browser situation. That'll keep a more stable connection with Zoom. This meeting will be recorded and made available through the city's website. I'll do introductions in a moment, but again, just a few housekeeping items. Plan to mute yourself. If you're new to Zoom, that's down on your own image. You'll see the a little red microphone on other people's image. That means they're muted. So mute yourself if you're not speaking, and that'll limit the amount of background noise that we have. And if we have any background noise, I'm gonna allow the administrator to have the privilege of muting people. So if you need to say something in the chat function, go right ahead. We will have a time for questions. Of course, that's gonna probably be the primary portion of this portion of the meeting. And so don't worry about having time, maybe jot those questions down. We're gonna use the platform chat. If you're not familiar with chat, it's down at the bottom of your screen. And the default, which we're gonna use just to make it easy for everyone, is that you're gonna be chatting with everyone. So if you'd like to pose questions throughout the presentations, you can go ahead and shoot them off as you think of them, or hang on and then type them in at the point at which we have questions. At the first portion of the meeting, we're going to flip, I think, what the agenda said. I'm going to allow Daniel Marks, our city's attorney, to give the context of the overall situation where the city's piece of this is at. And so we can take some questions for Daniel then. Then the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers will give us a second presentation. We can take questions then. I'm sure Dan would also entertain some questions at that point if they come to you at that point. So the platform chat is how we're going to do our Q&A. If you happen to be calling in, and I have to say, as a non-host, I cannot see who is just calling in with their phone, although it appears there might be a couple. We'll take a point and pause after the chat questions have been addressed so that we can basically allow people to unmute themselves and ask their questions. As you're thinking of your questions, if you have a big question, maybe parse it out into multiple questions just so that our presenters can answer in about 2 minutes or less. That just allows us to answer as many questions as possible. And I'm going to make a point of stopping us at about 7:45 so that we have an opportunity to wrap up and answer any of those further questions. I know the Port Authority has a big agenda on their regularly scheduled meeting. Anything that I'm not missing from a meeting management standpoint, City Hall? Okay.
Do we want to do the Pledge of Allegiance to start the meeting?
We can. Yep, let's do that. We'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Tyler. All right. So I will kick off with introductions all at once, although we're going to hear from these presenters in two different formats. So Daniel Marks is with us from the great city of St. Paul. He's waving at you right now. He's got a beautiful bay of windows looking out onto a lovely evening in St. Paul. We have been consulting with Daniel since years back on this project. Daniel is an environmental and administrative lawyer, works for Flaherty and Hood, who is the city's attorney. So Daniel, we look forward to your presentation, and he'll give a context. He'll give the context from the city's perspective on a few of these pragmatic issues related to the larger issue of material management. Bob Edstrom is with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He's in the great city of New Orleans, where he is living, but he works for the St. Paul district and has for some time. He's the project manager on this project and has again served this project for a number of years. And then Paul Majewski is our channel maintenance coordinator in the Pool 6 and maintains the federally authorized 9-foot channel and its navigation on the upper Mississippi. Paul is our local contact. I think of him as very local, and we see Paul a lot, and you probably do too. So with those brief introductions, I'm going to let Daniel go ahead. I think Daniel wants to screen share, and I'm sure Tyler or Caroline can help with that.
Thank you, Mayor and Council and Port Authority members. Give me a minute here. I'm going to get my screen sharing. I think it looks like I have access, so just give me 1 minute and it'll be up and running. Can everybody see the slideshow? A thumbs up from somebody would be great. All right. The other key test is it moving for you?
It's good.
Great. All right, well, thank you, everybody. So again, my name is Daniel Marks. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Flaherty and Hood. I'm kind of a special project counsel that does a lot of environmental and administrative law and advocacy work. And I've been working on this project with the city now since I think things started in 2017. So I'm just going to be pretty brief tonight. There's a lot of familiar faces, but I want to just provide some overarching background and context for the discussion. And here's just a little roadmap of what we're going to cover. Provide a little context. We'll outline what the proposed public-private partnership or the Section 217D agreement with the Corps is, and then we'll talk a little about what the next steps are, and then where there will be further opportunities for public engagement, because there's obviously been a lot of interest in this issue for some time. So background, as most of you, if not all of you recall, this issue really goes back to the spring of 2017 and probably for some before that. And that's when the Corps, or USACE as it's referred in the presentation, the Army Corps initiated the public comment process for the Dredge Material Management Plan, or the DMMP. And as you remember, the critical concerns from the city's perspective and the local community with respect to the DMMP was that initial plan, as presented in 2017, identified both the Southside Fitzgerald neighborhood area of the city, along with the Drysdale farm sites, as either temporary or permanent transfer or placement sites for dredge material. And obviously that issue presented a lot of concern in the local community, and the city began a process to work with the Corps to look at alternatives to those placement sites. So the city engaged in the public comment process, requested an extension of the comment deadline, and then worked with its consultants and team to submit detailed public comment to the Corps through that public process, and essentially at a very high level made two kind of key requests of the Corps. One, to address the city's concerns with the Southside Fitzgerald and Drysdale sites and really have them be removed as kind of operational pieces from the DMMP, or the Dredge Material Management Plan. And then the city also requested that the Corps, engage in a process with the city to look at alternatives to those sites that would allow for more collaboration. And that's really been the process that we'll summarize briefly, but that's been going on for quite some time. And it's a long process, but it's long because there's a lot of moving parts and complicated legal and regulatory framework. And obviously we've been in the middle of a pandemic for the last year and a half or so, right? So as you recall, in June of 2018, after some significant back and forth, the city and the Corps were able to reach a memorandum of understanding, which was essentially spelling out an agreement to make an agreement for this Section 217D public-private partnership. So the MOU, as you recall, was, excuse me for 1 minute, I got a little background noise. I'm going to shut the window. I apologize. I got little kids out in the backyard. The joys of Zoom. So as you recall, this was it took some time, but the city was able to work with the Corps and the Port Authority to negotiate a memorandum of understanding. And it was in June of 2018 that at the time, Colonel Calkins, who was the representative of the Corps leadership, commander of the St. Paul district, came to the council, and there was a little ceremony, and that MOU was signed and executed by the city and the Corps. And that really that MOU has kind of guided and laid the framework for the ongoing discussions related to the development of this public-private partnership agreement between the city, the WPA, and the Corps. So the Section 217D agreement, in October of 2018, the city submitted a proposal to USACE for this agreement, and that proposal has been updated, based upon feedback from the Corps and others, and was resubmitted essentially in 2020. And at a very high level, what the Section 217D agreement, right, it's working with a particular provision of federal law that gives the Corps flexibility to engage in public-private partnerships that can facilitate cost-effective dredge material management. And it's a unique opportunity. There hasn't been very many of these agreements done in the country, and there's really never been an agreement like this with a city the size of Wabasha or in this context. So we're in real novel legal regulatory territory, and that's one of the complicating factors here and why this takes time. So the key components of the city's proposal, right, was and kind of the objective behind the city engaging in this process with the Corps, right? First and foremost, I think the city's goal throughout this process was to protect the interests of its citizens and the local community, and ensure or work to ensure that that Southside Fitzgerald site and those Drysdale sites would not be used as a part of this dredge material management plan. So that's been the key focus of city staff and consultants over the years, is to really take the will of the public and work with the Corps to find an alternative solution. And this Section 217D agreement is the vehicle with which we are operating to do that. So the key components of our proposal essentially would ensure that USACE won't use the Southside Fitzgerald or Drysdale sites for the duration of this 20-year DMMP. It also provides, or potentially provides, the city and the Port Authority more ownership and control over management and placement of dredge sand going forward. So that's one of the potential benefits to the city and the Port Authority, is it gives the city and the Port Authority an opportunity to have more say than would be normally available under the traditional model, to really determine where the sand that is going to be coming off the river and moving through Wabasha, where and how that's going to happen. The Section 217D legal framework gives the Corps the authority to reimburse the city, the WPA, and any third parties that they have to engage for costs related to the management and placement efforts, and then also can pay a reasonable return on investment. So it's not really, I wouldn't think of it as a money-making program for the city, but it does, it should in theory pay for itself and provide a reasonable return on investment. And then a key portion of this Section 217D agreement is the facilitation the potential development of this port facility that we'll talk about a little bit. And the port facility really is key to the city's plan, the operation plan that the city has proposed as a part of the Section 217D agreement. I think it's important to clarify that the port facility is not something that is technically required by the Corps for the city to develop to participate in the Section 217D agreement. But as the city has gone through and evaluated the least cost options available to the city and then therefore the Corps, this port facility has been identified as a potentially critical component of the city's operating plan to be able to manage the dredge material. So that's another critical component of this potential Section 217D agreement. Lastly, I think it's critical to note that that agreement is not final, right? We have been engaged in, I think, significant collaborative discussions with the Corps. We've been meeting regularly, but it's a process that we anticipate will still take some time to hammer out the details of the agreement. And then the agreement, right, has to go through the city process for final approval. And then I think more complicated will be going through the Corps' internal processes for final approval. And so it's not something that is imminent per se, but it's something that we're actively working on with the Corps in good faith. So what are the next steps in this process? USA, so the Corps is going to be publishing the next iteration of the dredge material management plan, and I know that they're going to cover that process in detail. I just think from the public standpoint and from the city standpoint, and the Corps will cover this, that there will be opportunities for the city and the WPA to review and comment, and they will do so again with the interests of the city in mind. And then that comment period will be open to the public as well. So the public will have the opportunity to review the next iteration of the Corps' plan. And then from the city's perspective, finalizing and then executing the Section 217D agreement and the operating plan that is a critical piece of that agreement is something that we're actively working on. And again, that will be subject to both final approval of the council and the Port Authority. So there'll be public engagement opportunities there. And then ultimately, it must be approved by USA's headquarters. And I think they will talk a little bit about what that looks like. But essentially, there's a federal process that requires sign off from the higher levels of the Corps to do something like this. So a couple of other key next steps and opportunities for public engagement. If the Section 217D agreement does get finalized, then it may require some internal steps for the city in terms of getting its ducks in a row to be able to facilitate implementation of the Section 217D agreement. And those things could or may include the following. It may require some amendment to the city's comprehensive plan, related to rezoning and planning. And that will be a juncture where there will be opportunities for public comment. So amendments to the city's comprehensive plan, the city is required to use a public process for doing that. And so there will be opportunities for the public to weigh in and get an opportunity to review, how things are moving. The second piece there would be potential property acquisition related for the port operations agreement. So acquiring property that will be necessary to operate consistent with the with the agreement. And again, that is something that would be subject to city council and Port Authority approval potentially. Also, this plan, if implemented, could require some planning and rezoning actions that would be necessary to accommodate the development of the port facility and the other management placement activities that the city will take on as a result of this agreement. And again, the planning and rezoning process provides ample opportunity for public input, public involvement, and comment. And then key is for the port facility, if the port facility component of this project moves forward, one of the critical pieces there will be following the environmental review process that's required under state and federal law. And I won't go into the details of that process now, but there will be ample opportunities for the public to review and comment on that port facility through the environmental review process. And then finally, the last piece of this would be construction of the port and really implementing the agreement. And I will just conclude with saying, a lot of information here, and this is just kind of a picture of the next steps. Unfortunately, it's difficult to predict kind of the timing of when all this is going to happen. But I think, obviously the pandemic slowed things down, but we have been, for the last several months now, meeting with the Corps regularly, twice a month or so to really start hammering out the details and engaging in the process. So with that, I will conclude kind of the overview, and then Mayor, maybe I'll turn it back over to you to kind of facilitate questions and whatnot.
Thank you, Daniel. So the chat, again, for anyone who'd like to add a question, is at the bottom of the screen. It looks like a little thought bubble or speech bubble. If you struggle with that for any reason, and if you're not new to Zoom, it's not super easy, but if you struggle with that for any reason, you'll also see on the bottom an icon that says reactions. It looks like a little smiling emoji. There is an opportunity to just raise your hand, and I'll click through and see if anyone's raising their hand, and then I'll ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question verbally. Maybe I could ask city staff to monitor the chat while I do that. Or maybe Daniel was so clear in his presentation that there are no questions at this time. I'm not seeing any hands. Okay, I'm going to have one more option. If your video is on and you have a question, you can just wave your hands frantically in your video screen, and I'll introduce you there too. No, I do think that was a very clear presentation, Daniel. Thanks very much for that. We'll pause just for a second here and make sure there's nothing coming in through the chat. I do see one question. Question for Daniel. Once finalization is complete, what's the time frame for the project getting started, making its way through the process? It's the big $1 million question, right?
Yeah, and that's a tough one, Josh, to be frank. I think that we're still discussing with the Corps the details of the Section 217D agreement, and the way that that agreement gets structured could change or prioritize the timing of certain actions that the city takes. And so we're kind of waiting to see. But I think that realistically, going through the environmental review process, if that's required, any changes to the comprehensive plan, planning and zoning requirements, I think that is, easily a year-plus process, and that would be an aggressive timeline.
Thanks, Daniel. Another question. Oh, I'm sorry, this is Bob just commenting. I thought he might say this. During the core piece, they'll be able to discuss schedule too. So we'll get to that. I'm sure Bob will be much firmer in his timeline. Yeah, there's just a lot of undetermined variables in terms of timing. Even just meeting schedules draw things out tremendously, just the availability of the deciding parties. So, but that's a good question. Okay, again, I'm looking for either the little Zoom hand or anyone's actual hand. So far, so good. All right.
Mayor Duran, I'm
Yes,
happy
Bob.
to start presenting too, and then at that point, maybe by kind of linking our presentation back to Daniel's and kind of coming full circle, that might elicit more questions. But I see one just popped up.
That sounds great. Yep. Another question related to Daniel's comments is who's going to pay for the maintenance of the project going forward into the future?
Thank you. That's a great question. Obviously, I'm getting a little echo. Maybe it's okay. We're good. So the way that the Section 217D law is structured is that the Corps has the authority to pay for the costs associated with the management of the dredge material and potentially, construction components related to any facility or facilities that are necessary for that management material. And then pay, in addition to kind of the costs, a reasonable return on investment. And so the way that this is intended to be structured and the way that we have kind of set it out in the MOU is that this will be primarily funded through that Section 217D agreement through what's called a tipping fee, which is a financial arrangement that we're negotiating with the Corps to essentially pay for the costs and then reimburse or pay a reasonable return investment for the city. So that's how the idea will be structured. Now, with related to, purchase, land acquisition, facility construction, all those details and kind of how that's going to be paid for needs to be worked out. But it's contemplated that the primary compensation mechanism to reimburse the city will be through the Corps of Engineers. I think that's fair to say in terms of how the Section 217D agreement is being negotiated and can be structured under applicable law.
And the maintenance costs are included in that calculation. The ongoing maintenance costs are included.
It looks like there's another question about liability should something go wrong in the terminal. So I will take an initial stab and then I will do some classic lawyer punting as well. So excuse me for that, but there's a lot of unknowns still. But I'll at least be direct about my lawyer punting. So I think, again, the way that this agreement is going to be structured or is intended to be structured, right, is the city would be the owner of any port facility and would be responsible for managing the dredge material. The material, the Corps is responsible for the material, and this is still kind of open to negotiation and further discussion, but the actual material itself, right, the Corps is responsible for until the city takes ownership of that. And there are some things that provide, lingering protections about the material itself, etc. But then the liability, I think if you're talking about something going wrong at the terminal, I think the way that if the city is owning that port facility, etc., that liability would be the city's, and that would need to be addressed through typical ways that the city would address that kind of liability, insurance, etc. But again, some of those details are going to be really contingent upon how the Section 217D agreement gets finalized, and things like that. So I hope that addresses the question, address it as much as we can at this point, I think.
We have another question. Would the agreement be for 20 years like the DMMP? So that I think this is in reference to the 217D, or is there a different time frame for the agreement between the city and the Corps?
So the city's proposal to the Corps under the 217D framework is essentially for a 10-year agreement. So an overarching kind of master agreement that would hold for 10 years, and then that would be renewable at the expiration of that agreement. So the idea is that we have an operating plan and the potential to do this, and implement this agreement feasibly for 20 years. But the proposal for the city would be to do one 10-year term and then have that agreement renewable for another term. And much of those details are still being worked out between the Corps and the city. But the proposal is, yes, essentially that this agreement would be contemplated to be feasible for that 20-year DMMP period.
Give pause for any additional questions. Otherwise, we'll move on to Bob and Paul. And your questions may percolate through that presentation. And again, I think Daniel will hang on with us here. Okay, I'm looking for hands. All right, seeing none, just to be respectful of everyone's time, I think I'm going to let Bob and Paul kick off with their overview of the DMMP process, where we're at. Go ahead, Bob.
All right, so originally we're most familiar with WebEx, and when we share something, we can't see people's faces and reactions, but I'm realizing in real time that Zoom's a little different. So I'm willing to share my notes with the caveat that, they weren't reviewed by by all my supervisors and public affairs and all that. So take them with a grain of salt, but I try to just put my thoughts down there of things I wanted to cover. And I think it might be easier for people to just be able to see the bullets I'm talking off of. So I'm gonna go ahead and share that if I can find. I think I'm doing this right, so just let me know. Can you see that? Maybe not. Okay. All right. So the first image you should see is like a dredge, a little picture of a dredge, and then a little mini agenda there on the side.
Mhm.
I'll move that then. So getting to our navigation mission, for those that have been kind of in the trenches with us for a long time, a lot of these bullets in this little mini presentation will look very familiar because I've stolen it from other presentations and tried to condense it down. So basically our charge, our mission from Congress is to maintain the navigation channel on the Mississippi River for commercial navigation that is currently authorized at 9 feet. In Pool 4, so we have 13 locks and dams from Minneapolis down to Guttenberg, Iowa. Pool 4 produces a quarter of all the volume of dredge material that we dredge in any given year. So that's quite a bit, and that equals about 250,000 cubic yards. So we're at about 1 million total for the entire district every year, and a quarter of that load is coming from one pool and generally from one tributary, the Chippewa. So our old plan was basically the Great Study from 1980, and a lot of the sites identified there are still in play, but they're nearing capacity or even past designed capacity. So that would be like the Wabasha gravel pit that most citizens in Wabasha will be familiar with, to the north side of town. And then other pits and the islands in the area are at similar capacity. It wasn't totally understood at the time, or maybe it was and just agreed that it was the lesser of two evils, but double handling the material by storing it on an island in the river and then finding a permanent home for it later once the island was full is what we refer to as double handling, and it's proven incredibly expensive for the national taxpayer. So that's something we're very aware of and kind of a paradigm that we're trying to get away from. Speaking really quickly on our planning process, most folks will be familiar with this process. It's basically a reiteration of what we did in 2017. So right now we're in what we would call plan reformulation, where we're trying to address the comments from 2017. To a large degree, we pretty much threw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, and started over. So it's not really a true reformulation as much as just a restart. Many of the sites stayed in our matrix, and we just reorganized things, but then the language of the report was largely rewritten. In fact, actually multiple times over the course of the last 4 years. So one of the last kind of tenets of the reformulation on the core side is to contact the landowners identified in the plan. This is very much a lesson learned from the last time we did this. Policy at that time was a little more rigid, and almost from going through a lot of the I guess just the tough times of the original to the Pool 4 report, kind of in a weird way put a lot of tools back in our toolbox and let us kind of take a fresh look at the way we were doing business and policy and regulations, and really kind of got the notice of our senior leaders, which was arguably a good thing. So a big lesson learned there, contact. So we're in the process of that. The other piece there is to complete the core review of the draft plan. So that's our internal review, which is called the DQC. That's the district quality control. So that's like a for every person in our district that helped write the report, another person that basically sits beside them would review the report for them. And then we have the ATR/MSC. So that's a sister district, completely different from our district in St. Paul reviewing the report. And then our MSC, which is our Major Subordinate Command, which is our division office down in Vicksburg, Mississippi. So two different fresh sets of eyes that had really nothing to do with writing the report, which hopefully gives us a better product in the end. And then we get to the public release of the draft report and the EA in a public meeting. And that's where we would share the current status and gather a new round of public comments on that plan as amended or reformulated from 2017. And then that public meeting would kickstart the public review period. It's typically 30 days. We extended in 2017 multiple times, and I think the total time frame was over 100 days. So we'll be having internal discussions about what the right length of time is. It'll probably be more than 30 days because this is arguably, not really arguably, it definitely is one of the most complex DMMPs we've ever come up with. Then we would review those comments, adjust the plan as needed, and then the hope is to eventually finalize and implement the 20-year plan. So that's kind of the core process. It speaks to timeline a little bit. The DQC, for example, is a 30-day review. The ATR and MSC review, there's a slash in there because they're concurrent, but that's another 30 days. And then however long we determine the public review period today to be. So you'll get a sense that just the reviews alone is in excess of 90 days. And then to finalize the plan as is and reach out to all the landowners identified in the plan. And we're probably at a minimum looking well past summer for completion of the report and implementation. That assumes everything goes swimmingly, which is generally, not assumed at this point. Let's talk real estate acquisition real quick. This is a nuance in the report that we wanted to be really transparent and clear about. The real estate policy for the Corps of Engineers is to acquire property in fee first, if possible. So a lot of times when you see an alternative within the report, it'll say we want to purchase it in fee. That's a pretty standard policy, and it's not something we can really get around. So we usually state that in the report, knowing that in the background, we're having conversations with those landowners, with the city, with the community members, and other folks that would be, involved in those parcels or those properties. And oftentimes we're more seriously considering some lesser estate like an easement or some type of working agreement for use of that property. But the report itself will read pretty dogmatically that we're looking at in fee. That is, one of those kind of hard and fast rules, unfortunately. The second bullet there, once we've the requirements are satisfied for stating we want to get in fee, then we can work to negotiate for lesser estates. There's a non-standard estate approval process, which goes through the real estate chain of command and takes additional time, but generally it's a positive, and we end up with kind of what we were hoping to get in the end anyway with the landowners rather than in fee. So that's just a nuance I wanted to point out. I know it'll be something that people kind of react to within the report. We're kind of making a point of stating that up front. So kind of taking this all full circle and getting to really what we're all here for is the current plan status. It's the reformulation of the 2017 report, which is basically a rewrite. I've pretty much covered that. The report is nearly complete. We did start internal reviews and then working through some new concepts like the idea of willing sellers. That's not really been defined for the Corps before, so we had to take a step back. You'll see that I just kind of refer in the notes to multiple setbacks and complexities and rewriting the report. A lot of that was internal. We were challenged by our senior leaders to really take a revolutionary approach to dredge material management. And you can imagine with a lot of people that have been in their positions for a long time, that's really difficult for them to kind of think that way or be challenged that way. So Paul and I have fought a lot of uphill battles that people will never see, and we've fought a lot of battles in the public realm, and we're very thankful for the coordination and the relationship with the city. Especially over the last 4 years, it's really turned into something awesome and fruitful, and we want to keep that going. I'm just glancing down at some of the stuff I wrote down. We're really stressing relationships. I think that was a big part of the last 4 years and why it took some time to get here. But I think the product that you will eventually see during public review, it will be much better off for that and reflect those relationships. And then I'd just like to kind of end on the 217 concept. When we write a DMMP, the tentatively selected plan is kind of the alternative that bubbles out to the top. And then within a bunch of other alternatives, we'll have different tiers as kind of risk aversion or fallback options. Should 217 not work out. And so a few points that I'd like to make about 217, and a lot of this Daniel already talked about. The Corps can pay a tipping fee. It still has to remain the least cost option to the government, as measured against the other alternatives within the report. And then we can pay the cost up to what the city incurs plus reasonable return on investment, as he stated. Some of the benefits are that the city can be directly involved in the management choices of the material. And then for the Corps side, it really overcomes some of the difficulties with the lack of sites, and it partially combats transportation costs, which are the significant cost driver for a plan like this. So that helps a lot. I also wanted to point out that the 217 is really subject to capacity, and there's not really any teeth in the way that the law was designed or in the agreement as we're exploring it with the Port Authority and Daniel. So that is to say, there's not really like a punishment or some mechanism, that punishes the city if they don't keep up. The Corps would simply revert back to the DMMP and go to the next alternative. So I wanted to point that out, and then describe maybe more of a typical use for what Section 217 was written for. I'm gonna close out my notes here. Hopefully you can just see me talking again, because this wasn't even in the notes. But 217 was a 1996 WRDA bill passed into law, and Section 217 subparagraph D is what we're talking about, if anybody wants to get on Google and look that up. But it basically was this kind of nuanced little law that allowed for the Corps to pay. At that time in history, there was a bunch of harbors that were really dirty, and the Corps was having a really hard time managing that material. What they ended up doing was coming up with Section 217, which allowed a non-federal entity to basically build vertical structures, and then the Corps could place their fill that they would take out from the bottom of the harbors into those siloed structures for a tipping fee. That material would basically stay there indefinitely, and that was very polluted material, but it kept the harbor open, and the Corps kind of paid the cost for the land and the structure. We're trying to take that and apply it from a harbor mechanism to channel maintenance. So we're looking at, pools in the river that are several river miles long. But what we realized is where we're really truly dredging in those pools is our much smaller, more defined areas. And so we had a really good young lawyer at the time, Alex Webb, who found this obscure Section 217 idea, and we've kind of ran with it since then. So that was kind of the birth of the idea and what it was originally meant for. And we're taking that in the spirit of revolutionizing dredge material and applying it towards channel management for the first time. So Daniel was correct. We really don't have a model or a template within the Corps of Engineers to go off of. We will be the first. That pretty much, that concludes everything. And Paul and I are ready to take questions, Mayor.
Bob, did you want to speak any further to timeline?
Yeah, so
I know it's not an answerable question. I just wondered if you had a spin on it because it's.
Yeah, so the report will encompass an EA, an environmental assessment. We believe we could be done with the report after we contact the landowners identified in the report, but that's going to take some time. Once that plays out, we still have the reviews I talked about before, including the public review. That's a minimum of 90 days. We'd probably be looking much more safely at like 120 days, so 4 months. That's once the report's completed, not 4 months from today. And then besides that, the tentatively selected plan for the report, I can confidently say will most likely be Section 217. And that is a separate agreement that's being drafted, in real time with the city. So that's going to have its own timeline as well. So one is kind of beholden to the other. So in terms of timeline, if I really had to shoot from the hip, I'd say maybe by next dredge season, we're living under a new dredge material management plan and a Section 217 agreement. But that's if a lot of things fall into place. And like I said, it's the first time ever. So going through a lot of the admitted bureaucracy of the federal government review process, unfortunately take that with a grain of salt, but I think it's something to shoot for.
Thank you. We have a couple questions. One is segues off to this question came at the end of Daniel's comments, to be fair, but it segues off what you were just saying with regards to the environmental assessment, Bob. What are the environmental issues? If they're lengthy, should they be addressed now before you go forward with agreements with the city? And maybe Brian Mullen wants to comment too. I'll leave that open, let you guys hand the microphone back and forth.
Well, I'll start and just say with reference to the dredge material management plan, we do have kind of an all-encompassing environmental assessment that always follows our DMMPs, and that will cover any environmental effects we expect to have as a result of implementation of any of the alternatives identified in the DMMP. So those will be covered. They'll be covered in the EA that pertains to the report, and then identify any like subsequent or follow-on actions for implementation of any of those alternatives. I hope I answered that from the government perspective. That might have been more specific to the port and stuff. So I'll let Brian and Dan speak to that.
So I'm not sure if I fully understood the question, but if you're talking about timing of environmental review versus other things, was that, I guess I wasn't really understanding the question.
Sure, I'll just read it again. I get your point. What are the environmental issues? If they're lengthy, should they be addressed now before you go forward with agreements? I think this is a question of which steps come when.
Right. Well, I would say the environmental review for the port facility would have to be completed before any permits are issued or any construction happens on the port. I think the timing of agreements, the 217D agreement, that's a question that the port and the city will have to wrestle with a little bit, is what happens first, at what point are they comfortable signing the agreement, at what point in the process does that happen? That is a question that will need to be answered.
And Mayor, if I can, just briefly, I think some important context too. I mean, so the key environmental social issues, right, that were identified by the residents of Wabasha and the city and the Port Authority were the placement of the material on Southside Fitzgerald, right? And that was kind of in the initial plan. And the focus of this agreement and this updated process was to address those environmental social impact issues. And so I think a lot of the key concerns identified by the city and residents have been addressed or are being addressed through this process. And then I would agree with Brian and Bob's statement of kind of the environmental review process. I mean, so the CORS process constitutes an National Environmental Policy Act environmental review process. So that's the DMMP process. And then if the port facility goes forward, that will require its own environmental process consistent with state and federal law. So there will be ample opportunities for the federal government and the city to flesh out those environmental issues in detail and then give the public an opportunity to review and comment on them.
Thank you. Another question, how difficult of a process is it to clean up the dredge material or materials for reuse? So this is in terms of beneficial use. Are there third-party facilities that have the capability to wash the sand and sediment? And would those facilities, if possible, be under the Port Authority's control or another entity's control?
So real quick, Mayor, let me back up to that. There's one question right before that.
Oh, yes, I missed it. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Let's do that one.
To be finalized before the 217 agreement can be finalized. That's a pretty easy one for me to tackle. So they're going forward concurrently. We're writing the draft agreement with the city at the same time as we're trying to finalize the DMMP. The really good, strong, supportable assumption there is that 217 will be backed by our commander for the St. Paul district and the general for the Mississippi Valley division. So we're taking, the gamble to do them concurrently. But yes, what the 217 is subject to the completion of the DMMP report. So once the report's done, until the report is done, we couldn't sign an agreement, basically. But they're moving ahead together, but one is subject to the other.
Thanks, Bob. So now back to this issue of beneficial use and cleaning, and an entity, would that be under the Port Authority's control or another entity?
So I'll tackle that quick because I think I might have been confusing. So the original intent of the 217 was to dredge harbor material in harbors out east predominantly that were very, for lack of a better term, it was dirty material. It was contaminated material. So they were looking at storing it long term and not for reuse. Our material in Pool 4 is very, very, very clean. And we have the environmental records, the testing documentation to show that. We test it every 5 years from random parts of all the piles that we maintain. And Paul can speak to that program within operations, but our material is very clean and immediately available for reuse. And typically we store it. Right now, you could drive to the Wabasha gravel pit, for example, and take our material as a member of the public for reuse, as long as you're complying with your local ordinances and permitting requirements for whatever you might be doing with the material. I'll add that caveat, but it's very clean fill. It's been good for a number of uses that we're familiar that people use it for, like road treatment, cattle bedding. The list goes on, but it's very clean. I just I can't hit that enough.
Good. All right. And there's a comment that the city has already completed a wetlands review on the port site per statute rules. And we have another question. What are the consequences of the environmental effects from the extra barge traffic and also the tourism and recreational use of the river to the area? What percentage of the dredge material gets used? I guess these are really two separate questions. I thought it might be a sort of an add-on, but really this first question, what are the consequences of the environmental effects from the extra barge traffic? So if somebody wants to speak to the expected barge volume, and also to tourism and recreational use of the river to the area, which is related, but I don't know whether it's answerable by this panel.
So if the question is geared towards the proposed port facility or the possible port facility, that question would be answered through the environmental review process. That's the whole purpose the environmental review process that would be done is to help answer those kinds of questions. So we wouldn't have the answer to that today. That would be the purpose of doing the environmental reviews, to help answer those kind of environmental related questions.
And then the separate question is, what percentage of the dredge material gets used for beneficial purpose?
I'm gonna maybe ask if Paul can weigh in on that one. That would be ideal. I know it's different from site to site, pool to pool. In pool 4, you know, we're by some larger communities, so I think it does get used pretty steadily. But we're also, you know, we're producing a quarter of everything in of the district average per year. So, Paul, if you're there.
Yep, I'm here. Thanks, Bob. That's a good answer. To keep it simple, I would say probably 50 to 75% of the material that we dredge throughout our district from Minneapolis to Iowa gets reused for beneficial use. All that really remains for beneficial use are some piles like the Wabasha gravel pit that has so much sand in there that, you know, but a big percentage of that sand goes every year too. I think 30 to 50,000 yards at least leaves that site for beneficial use purposes. So easy answer, not quantified, but it's, you know, throughout the district, 50 to 75% goes to beneficial use.
Very good. And there's a comment, I can't quite tell if it's a complete question or not. The very last one, Port Authority, the city has everything with promoting the city. Maybe if somebody could add to that question. And I'm going to look for hands again, because I wasn't doing that. I was listening to the answers. Anybody have a question and not able to chat? Again, you can use the, if you're just, if your video is not on, you can use the reactions button at the bottom of Zoom, and there's a little wave your hand or raise your hand. Any hand will do. If you give us a crying emoji, I'm still going to see it. Or if you can't do that, just go ahead and wave your actual hand. I'm not seeing any there. Okay, I mentioned that we were at 1/4 to the hour, but we had good questions coming. We are at 5 to the hour. Certainly would entertain any further questions. Okay, here's one. Will there be another public meeting when the plan becomes available? Bob, you spoke to that a little bit. Maybe you just want to reiterate that piece of it.
Yep, absolutely. Like Daniel said much more eloquently than me, even cited the act and everything. But basically, at a minimum, it's mandatory for our dredge materials management plans to have a 30-day public review. Because of the history on this one, we're already internally talking about a much longer review. You know, maybe 45 or 60 days or whatever it is. But yes, there will absolutely be a public meeting in the community to kick off the public review period of the what we'll refer to as the final draft report and environmental assessment. And then that'll go through that timeline of you know, let's say 30 to 60 days of review. And then the review will end, and then the Corps will take time to incorporate those comments into the revised draft before calling it final and going through the remainder of the process. So yes, absolutely, there will be another public meeting.
Great. Anything further? Certainly still have a few moments. I'll give it, even if we hear another question here, I'll just give an advance thank you to our presenters. You know, this meeting, in my mind, I think all of us optimistically, when we started talking about this, you know, we all optimistically want the wheels of these processes to move as rapidly as they possibly can, even though we know they're complex. And we all thought optimistically this might even be an in-person meeting. So, you know, I guess it's good that we remain optimistic, but the reality, as Bob has spoken to, and certainly Daniel as well, there's a lot of process here. So I really appreciate everyone's attention to this. This update is important just to keep people's familiarity with the context and also some of the terminology and the process. You know, again, I think this meeting will be available. So if you in any way got a little lost or had other things going on while you've been watching tonight, you can revisit Bob's notes or Daniel's presentation from the beginning. or certainly facilitate questions through the city, and we'll get those answered for you. Any final questions, or we will make a motion to adjourn our special meeting? I think that's my next logistical requirement.
Mayor, I'll move to adjourn.
Very good. Tim, thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you for second from Jeff Sola. Thank you. All right. I guess we're officially supposed to take a roll vote when we're on Zoom. I'll let Tyler lead us there.
Friedmeier,
Yes.
Walrick,
Yes.
Sala,
Yes.
Falcom,
Yes.
Moyer. Moyer,
Dean's muted. Maybe he got called away. Dean says yes. He's
Got it.
chatted.
yep,
Yes.
and Durant.
Yes. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate your attention to the time. Look at that. This is the first time we've gotten things on time in a while. We've had busy agendas. Thanks to our presenters and everybody attending. I appreciate the participation from the public. I see we had about 36 people here at the height of our participation. So I appreciate that. And we'll let the Port Authority conduct their routine business.